gone, though my days are still long. In quiet I walk these dark halls, and now the cold consumes the fall. But I'm already gone. I'm already gone. I laid you out all the facts, and this ain't nothing but
All right, well, my track stopped, so I guess that means it's time to start. How's it going, everybody? You are back for week 7 of Mon Hills Audio Hour. And this week, we are going to be talking about drums and bass. If any of you are wondering why I chose to group those two things, that's because they're actually pretty closely related. They're both they both combine to form the foundation, both musically and sonically, of any song. The drum set provides the time structure against which all the other parts that the other instruments are playing are going to align with. And the bass is going to take that time structure and assign a pitch to it. And that pitch becomes the root against which all harmonies are built by the other instruments after that. So consequently, it's very important that your drums and bass both individually sound as good as they can, but also get along with each other as best as possible. Now, a large part of that has to do with performance. It really helps if you have a drummer and a bass player who know each other and are used to playing with each other and enjoy each other. But if that's not the case, there's certain things you can address in the editing phase with rhythmically aligning any hits between the drums and the bass that aren't quite right. They're going to be any sort of rhythmic misalignment is going to be most obvious in these particular instruments. But yeah, with that, we're going to get into best practices in mic selection, mic choice, mic placement for all the elements of a drum kit as well as a bass. We're going to talk about the arrangement of those elements in the stereo field, and then we're going to get into processing. So first, we're going to start with mics, and you can see I have here a picture of a drum set with some microphones around it. This setup, for me, represents like the most possible mics I would array around a drum set. This is all out. Obviously, it could be scaled back from here if need be or if taste required, but for me here, the last several months, this is kind of how I've just been doing it, and I've been enjoying the results of that. I've got closer pictures too that we'll get into, but just to kind of give you an overview here. So you see in the center, there's a single microphone backed off the kit. There are, to the sides of the kit, 2 silver microphones, and then above the kit, there are 2 microphones as well. There are close mics that you can't really see in this shot, and there are other room mics as well. But just in this picture alone, you can see that we've got at least 3 room perspectives, the 2 silver mics on the sides and the one in the center, and then 2 overheads. So we're going to go ahead and switch image here and focus on just the kick drum. Now, for kick drums, if you have the luxury of a ported head, which nowadays more often than not is the case, I've found that using 2 microphones, getting 2 perspectives on this kick drum tends to yield the best results. Inside the porthole, you can't really see it. It's kind of in a shadow, but that particular microphone is an Audix D6, which is kind of one of the usual suspects for miking the inside of a kick drum. It's a dynamic microphone. Other common choices would be an AKG D112 or an Electro Voice RA20. But usually you want to go with some dynamic mic for the inside because there's so much transient information. There's a lot of air moving, and it would have a tendency to clip out any sort of condenser diaphragm. And then on the outside, I'm using a condenser in cardioid pattern, pretty much aimed dead center at the resonating head, the outside head. As far as the aiming of the inner microphone goes, I typically, when I place the mic inside the porthole, I aim it to where it's looking up at where the batter will strike the batter head. This way, it's still getting that clear attack information, but it's not getting it direct on, so it's still manageable. And then outside head is dead center, probably 6 to 8 inches backed up off the resonating head. The thought process for using 2 microphones on a kick drum, for me at least, when I'm thinking about what I'm getting from each one, I'm using the dynamic mic inside the kick drum to capture all of the air moving, and this is going to give me like the sub-harmonic frequencies, like, you know, the 100 hertz and below, stuff that's barely audible but you feel it. And then with the outside condenser, I'm using that to pick up both the pitch content off the resonating head, like the actual pitch of the drum, as well as the transient snap of that air reacting against the back of that resonating head. Provides a lot of clarity and a lot of natural clarity too, more so than I think with miking the front side of the batter head, which is something some people do, which is totally valid. But again, this is just an example of what I do, what I've found that I like. But yeah, getting sub frequencies from the inside and then getting pitch content, like low mid frequencies and transient attack in the mid-range from the outside condenser. All right, so that's kick drums. We're going to move up to this section of the kit. And here we're looking at a rack tom, a snare drum, and the hi-hat. We'll start with the snare drum. I don't know how well you can see it, but kind of below where the rack tom is, you can see there's a Shure SM57 hanging out there. Kind of the go-to mic for snare drums always, mostly because they can absorb a lot of transient information, and it's really, really difficult to get them to distort, which is what you want with a snare drum, especially for anything that involves like rock or metal or anything with a lot of transient response coming out of the snare drum. That's kind of the center of your kit, and drummers tend to like to emphasize that as much as possible. So using something like an SM57 is generally your best bet with that. You'll notice with the way I've placed that mic, it kind of looks like it's far away from the drum, and it sort of is. I typically allow for around 2 inches of space between the mic and the drum, and I typically aim the microphone at the rim rather than the actual drum head. I've found that this prevents the pitch of the drum head from getting unmanageable. And also if the head is ringing at all, this kind of reduces the amount the mic is going to pick that up. And also if there are any rim shots or side sticks in the playing, this is going to pick that up really, really well, which is something I tend to like. Sometimes it's worthwhile to put 2 57s on a snare drum, one at the top head and one aimed underneath where the actual snare wires are making contact with the resonating head. That's pretty common. I do it sometimes. I prefer to only use a top head mic if I can get away with it, if the snare is tuned well and the drummer plays a certain way and the song allows for it. I tend to just use one mic, but if for some reason I'm not getting enough of the actual snare rattle that would be desirable, throw up another 57 up underneath. On the rack tom here, we've got a Sennheiser MD421, which is kind of also like just a standard go-to. Aim that at a tom and it'll sound exactly like a tom is supposed to sound, like completely dry. Notice I've got it aimed to the side here. The reason for that is I've found that if I'm aiming tom mics, specifically rack tom mics, top center, I get an overwhelming amount of snare bleed such that the tom mic basically just becomes another snare mic. Sometimes it's almost like ungateable, like you can't gate the snare out of it almost. So I've made that mistake enough to where now I've started placing my tom mics such that they're still out of the way of the striking path of the stick, but looking away from the snare as much as possible. So with the 421s, they are end address. You can't see it in this picture, but there's a black plastic stripe that runs around the center of the grill. That's the end of the mic. So you aim that plastic stripe at wherever you want the signal to be most prominent. I've kind of found that aiming for halfway between the center of the head and the rim is generally best. You get a nice blend of stick attack and pitch information. If you want a little bit more brightness, sharpness, more clarity of attack, you're going to want to cheat that microphone closer to aiming at the rim. And if you want more pitch information out of it, you want to cheat it closer to the center. But yeah, that's really all the more consideration that goes into that. Even less consideration goes into the hi-hat mic. You can see it's the black pencil condenser. So I have seen some consternation about the positioning of a hi-hat mic. Some people place it underneath in an effort to reduce snare bleed. But I found you lose out on a lot of stick attack information, which is kind of like what a hi-hat is for stick attack. So I typically will place the hi-hat or the hi-hat mic on a stand, aiming down at the top cymbal, sort of at an angle, again, halfway between the bell and the edge, kind of like same principle with the tom. reason that snare bleed isn't such a problem with this is because hi-hat information is so high in frequency that you can generally high pass past to the point where the snare pitch is. So it doesn't really matter that the snare's in there or not, because you're going to cut it out with your EQ anyway. Also take note of one of our room mics here, basically aimed at the side center of the kit. And there's another one aimed the same way on the opposite side that we'll look at in the next picture. But this, these pair of mics, I'm typically going to be using to kind of capture a fuller image of the kit as a whole. There's also, you get a lot of really nice like front end cymbal attack out of these, or front end attack out of everything really, if you aim them kind of at the level of the drums. I've found that it's particularly useful to have, like, to just bring this room pair up in the mix and just livens everything up. Okay, moving to our next slide here. So here you have the opposite side of those near room mics aimed looking across at each other. Also, we have a floor tom. Same principle applies with the floor tom as the rack tom. Same microphone, Sennheiser 421. Floor toms, I typically will tend to cheat the aim of that mic a little bit closer to the rim, just because they kind of have a tendency to get muddy, especially if there's a section of a song where the drummer's riding on the floor tom. It likes to stack up and get washy and harder to use. So I found that helps alleviate that issue. And moving to the overheads. And this also gives you kind of a view of the other room mics as well. But so these are condensers in cardioid. They are AKG C214s, really, really versatile mics. I enjoy using them as overheads. They really capture the full image of the kit pretty evenly and pretty nicely. And having these mics, or overheads in general, paired with multiple room perspectives kind of takes the pressure off of any one close mic in the kit, because you're also hearing these drums in all these other mics. So it kind of creates like a composite sound. Also makes it sound live and natural and like you're in the room with the kit, which is always, for me, a really cool element of a mix. The big consideration with overheads is making sure that they are relatively close to the same height away from the kit. For me, I typically will try to get them within reason, as high as I can, as high as the boom stands will allow, while still maintaining a horizontal sort of trend. I typically aim them across each other from the kit. So like with this left side, from the drummer's perspective, the left side overhead is aiming at the back edge of the floor tom, and the drummer's perspective right side overhead is aiming across that, kind of between the snare and the hi-hat. So between the two of those, they pick up everything in the kit, and giving them the most height allows those sound waves to develop like through at least one cycle. For cymbals and stuff, it's a couple cycles by the time it gets to those mics. But it just ensures that you're getting all the information that's there. More height also just has the effect of making your cymbals a little bit more manageable in the mix, a little less washy or harsh. And you can get your harshness from those near room mics that we talked about before. Also, while we're on this slide here, we can take a look at these other two room mics that weren't visible in that first shot. So when we're looking here, we see 3 more room perspectives. We see the center that we saw in the first picture, and then there's 2, you can kind of see them, these gold microphones here on either side of that, like splitting center. A little bit of a better shot. So the thought with these is these are going to pick up the early reflections coming off of the walls and the ceiling in the room. The gold pair of mics on the corners of this carpet. Generally as far away from the kit as the room allows, I've found is desirable. It just gives you the most ambient sound that you can get out of the room. As far as how they're aimed, I also cross them and make sure that they are, like the diaphragms of these microphones are at the same height as the diaphragms of the overheads. And so like with this the left corner room microphone, it's aiming across to the right side overhead, and vice versa on the other side. The right room mic is aimed across to the left side overhead. And we'll talk about why that is later when we get into the mixing of this. But it allows you to create some really cool effects by miking the room this way. And then in the center here, we have an Omni condenser. So far, all the mics we've used on this kit have been cardioid. This mono center mic is in Omni to pick up just in equal measure, like without frequency interference, pick up the entirety of the room from a center perspective. And again, we'll get into why that is when we get to the mix, but it it opens up a lot of possibilities too if you have that in addition to all these room mics. Again, this is just what I do. Here of late, I've been using 5 room perspectives. I've been using a stereo pair nearer to the kit, like on the sides, those little silver condensers that we saw earlier. Far pair of room mics, these gold condensers on the corners of the carpet, and then a mono Omni center mic, in addition to my close mics and my overheads. Some might say that's too many. Maybe it is, but I don't know. I've been enjoying the results I've been getting from them so far. And like I said, obviously it can be scaled back. As far as I'm concerned, the bare minimum that you could get by in a drum kit would be 1 mic on a kick, 1 mic on a snare, 1 mic per tom, and 2 overheads. If you have at least that, you can get by. But for me, having these room perspectives just it gives you more options in the mix, and it makes it sit in the mix a little bit better, just because you're not reliant too heavily on any one perspective to get the full image. So yeah, as far as bass miking goes, it's much less involved. Typically, with a bass guitar, at least, it's sufficient to DI the bass, meaning direct input, plugging the bass straight into a channel on your console or on your interface. The bass generally is just going to sound how it's going to sound, and you're using it for pretty low range frequencies, and the pickups on the bass are perfectly good at picking up and translating that information. So a lot of times just a single DI with a bass is plenty. In some instances, like in rock, metal, or, well, it's applicable anywhere, I suppose. Any situation where the bass player is using a cabinet, sometimes it's nice to mic the speaker cabinet as well. Although I don't think, in my opinion, this shouldn't be in place of a DI. This should be in addition to a DI. And the way to do that is have the bass player plug into the input of a DI, and most DIs have a throughput. So you'll bass player plugs into the input, and then you take a line out of that straight into your console or interface, and then use the throughput to feed the input of the amp, which feeds the cabinet, and then place a dynamic mic as close to one of the cabinet speakers as possible. And if you have the option, it's pretty cool and makes your life a little bit easier later if you are able to use the same dynamic microphone, like the same model of dynamic microphone as you're using on the inside of your kick drum on the bass cabinet. Similar philosophies as with the kick mic configuration to a DI and a cabinet mic on a bass. You can get all of your sub information from the DI because it's clean, it's straight out of the pickup. And then you can get more of your low mid actual pitch information from the cabinet, as well as any sort of drive that the bass amp might be applying. Any of those harmonic characteristics that are being added after the DI'd signal. Right, with that, we are going to flip over to Pro Tools. Okay. So here we have a session. I have removed everything except for the drums and the bass and the effects, the relevant effects for the drums. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, it sounds like this. So we've got this fun driving rock number. If we look at our channels here, we've got, it might be easier if I show the clips. We've got an inside and an outside perspective on the kick. In this case, I did take a top and a bottom snare mic. Both were 57s. Hi-hat, rack tom, floor tom, and this drummer plays with 2 floor toms, so 3 total toms. Overheads, a room pair. In this instance, I didn't take the 2 near room mics, but I'll show you where I would have used them had I taken them on this particular session. And then the mono center mic. And then there's also some auxiliary stuff. There's a cowbell track and a tambourine and some claps. And with the bass, we've got our DI signal here on top and our cabinet mic here on the bottom. One thing that is important to mention before we get much further into this, with a drum set where you're using so many mics on like sources, on sources that are near to each other and being played simultaneously, the more mics you use, the more you're opening yourself up to phase artifacts. That's not a reason to not do it. That's just to say that you have to understand when you go to edit, you're going to have to do a little bit more work in getting everything aligned in terms of the phase. If you remember back to our edit episode, I think it was week 3, where you were zooming in on a waveform and making sure that the troughs and peaks are as close to in line with one another as possible on sources where they're alike, making sure that both kick mics are in phase, both snare mics are in phase, making sure that the snare bleed in the overheads and in the room mics is in phase with the snare close mics, things like that. Making sure that the cymbal wash between the left and the right overhead aligns and in all the room mics and everything. And with the bass, taking two perspectives because the waveforms are so low and therefore so long and wide. There's a really high probability of phase cancellation because the DI'd signal is going to get to the console like a couple milliseconds ahead of the cabinet, because the cabinet has to travel, out of the bass into an amp, and then through an amp into speakers, and then through the air into a microphone, and then back to the console. Whereas the DI just has to go straight into the console. So a lot of times that amount of time is just enough to place the two like almost perfectly out of phase. So just make sure that before you get into mixing or fader balancing or anything, you've edited these and have checked the phase alignment. But I've done that on this session already. So now we can talk about processing. We'll start with the kick drum. Solo it up here. Let me find it. One thing to talk about too, to disclaim perhaps, this session is part of a full album for a group I'm working with, and the recording process has been rather drawn out, months apart between sessions sometimes. And consequently, it's the same kit every time, but a lot of times the tuning shifts. This particular drummer plays really hard, so a lot of times the tuning shifts between the morning and the afternoon. Changes like that are bound to happen in sessions that happen so far apart from each other. So one way to combat that is by using some sampling triggers. In this case, I'm doing that on the kick, the snare, and the toms, just to kind of normalize the kit across the full album as it's put together, so that the kick always sounds like the kick and the toms always sound the same. I'm using the triggers blended with, not to fully replace, but to mix with the original signal, just because I really don't like the way like exclusively triggered sound. Something weird happens to the transient information. I can't really describe it. It kind of like delays it and flattens it out in a weird sort of way. So I do like using it more for the pitch information to like make that more consistent. I'll show you what I mean here. So this is the triggering, and I'm using a couple different samples, but these are ones that we recorded in the studio with the expectation of using it for this purpose. And over here I can set the mix. So this is the mixed signal. That's the dry signal, and you can hear all the bleed in it because it's pre the gate that's on this. If I leave this off, I can kind of demonstrate the purpose of having two perspectives. So here's just the inside mic. So it's nice and solid, punchy, but it just kind of sounds like, like air moving. It doesn't really sound like a pitch necessarily. So that's where this outside mic comes in. Only downside of this is you're going to have a lot more bleed because it's outside the kit. But it gives you that low mid fullness, as well as that like mid-range snap of that attack. So when you blend the two, it starts to sound a little bit more, like a kick drum. Then you bring this in, and that's the gate, and it takes those original signals and just kind of makes them a little bit more consistent one to the next. Then we can talk about our EQ here. Some people might choose to EQ the in and the out mics independently. I used to do that as well. I found that using them just to set the blend of the total kick drum and then EQing them together is one, a little bit easier, and two, leads to a more natural sound after the fact. So here's what we're doing here. Starting with our filters, high passing up to 27 hertz. So what this does is cleans out any of the low, rumbly, subaudible mud that's in these microphones that we probably don't need. Gets rid of that, and then that allows me to be aggressive on my low shelf. I've got this low shelf we remember from week 4 in our EQ episode, what filters, shelves, and bells do. I've got the shelf parked at 63, and I'm adding over 5 dB of gain, but I'm able to do that safely because I've high-passed, cutting out anything below 27 hertz that would get really nasty if I boosted the low end by this much. So this allows a really nice, full, thick sub presence to come from this kick drum. I'm cutting out some of the mid-range, in this case 800 hertz. That's where a lot of that bleed is, which has been largely gated out. But also, like, the drums have a tendency to get a boxy sort of characteristic. Like, if I remove this, so you see how it kind of like thins out and sounds like it's made of cardboard, whereas it kind of re-emphasizes the low end, gives it more room to breathe. Then I'm adding a little bit of that snap attack that we were talking about, wanting to get out of that outside mic. I'm boosting that with a pretty wide Q range too. So this whole mid-range, just making sure it cuts through. In this full mix, on top of the drums and bass, there are a jillion guitars and a bunch of vocal tracks. So this is just to make sure that the kick stays clear and audible. And then I'm rolling off with my high shelf, anything above 2700 hertz. This just keeps any of that unnecessary information away from things that I actually need 2700 hertz in, like guitars or lead vocals, things like that. And then I'm low passing down to 9K. I'm also adding a little bit, like a little bit of compression, just 1.5 ratio, slow attack, pretty slow release, just to kind of stabilize the pitch and sustain of the kick, but without taking away too much transient information. All right, we move to the snare. So again, we're using some triggering here. That's the original without the blended trigger and the gate. Over here, again, a little bit of compression off the front, faster attack. So I'm shaping this transient a little bit, just to, because it is pretty prevalent, just to keep it tame, keep it from running away from me. Now on the snare, you don't need any sub information. So I tend to high pass up to 200, 210. And likewise, there's a lot of upper, like super high frequency content that you probably want for other things like vocals, background vocals, reverbs, things like that. So I'm low passing down to 12K. Now I'm giving this snare a little bit more pitch content, which tends to live in the 300-400 range. So I'm taking my high shelf again, just which gets cut off by the high pass, and boosting everything between 390 hertz and 210 hertz, just to give it a little more weight. That's without it. Kind of thins out, but then has a little bit more power behind it there. Cutting here in the low mids at 690. This is to keep it out of the way of the guitars. The guitars all kind of live in that range. So this is just to keep this from clashing with those and keep them distinct from each other. Adding back right around 2K for that clarity of attack. So without that, and if I bring it back, see how it kind of like jumps out that much more. Kind of changes the shape a little bit too, like it doesn't feel as flat. And then I'm giving it a little bit of sparkle, kind of above where like the top end of the first couple vocal harmonics are living, but only up to my low pass, of course. So I'm boosting with my high shelf, basically from 6K to 12K. Or sorry, from 7K to 12K. Just to give it just kind of that shimmery quality. Like here, I'll get rid of this. And then with our hi-hat, really not a lot going on here because it really doesn't need to be a lot going on. High passing up to 900 hertz. You don't need any of this low end information here. Giving it a little high shelf boost at 12K just to keep its head above water, but there's not a lot of frequency or dynamic content in a hi-hat. It's really just a timekeeper. So that's really all the more you need to do to it. Moving over to our toms, gating here becomes important. A little bit more compression out of the gate, out of to start with, to start our chain here. A little bit of still not much compression though. 1.8 ratio, slower attack, a little bit of a faster release. So just to kind of pad the backside of that first transient. All three toms are generally EQ'd the same way though, so we'll just do this one for the sake of time. Don't need as much low-end information as you would with a kick drum, but you still want some. So I'm high passing, depending on the exact drum, but around 100, 110, and then low passing down to 8.1-ish, just to keep any like annoying ringiness from taking up space in the high end. Shelf boosting below 200, because generally I try to leave space for these to poke through when they need, but still have like plenty of force behind them. A little bit of a high shelf boost just for clarity's sake, making sure that they ring through, because they're only active in the fills, so just making sure that they are audible when that happens without having to like have their fader too high. Tiny little cut in the upper mids, again, kind of keeps it out of the way of like this range, this this 3,000 range is where a lot of that kind of guitar wash, like that guitar hissiness kind of lives. Which I'm cutting in the guitars too, but like across this entire mix, rock mixes in general, that frequency range tends to stack up anyway. So I have space to cut it there, so I'm choosing to. I'm also cutting here at just below 600 hertz pretty significantly because that's where that kind of boxy, fake cardboard sounding tendency lives. And then moving to our room mics here. In this case, again, we've only got the overheads, the far room pair, and the Omni center. Notice they're all kind of similar. Generally, with all of them, you don't need a lot of the low end, but I've tended to leave some just for the sake of catching like fundamentals of snare and toms. A little bit of a dip here in the mid-range just to keep space, because everything is going through that frequency range in some capacity. And then making sure I set an upper boundary so that I have space to boost my top end overall later, which we'll talk about in later episodes. Selectively cutting and boosting certain frequencies that I want or don't want out of all of these, but in general, this is the trend. You don't need to mess with these a ton because the point is that they are ambient and just capturing natural sound. So you generally don't need to carve these up an obscene amount. I'm not going to worry about the auxiliary stuff for the sake of this. Those are all pretty minimal EQs. Next, we can talk about compression, though. On all of my drums, in this case, just because it sounded the best, on my kick, my snare, and my toms, I'm using a VCA compressor. This is the one for the kick. Now, compared to, notice I'm using it in stages. So I did a little bit on my channel here, just a tiny amount. Here, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive, using a 2-to-1 ratio, faster attack, and a faster release. Now, this is going to catch just a little bit of that transient to keep my kick in place, but not take so much of the front edge off of it that it loses its distinct quality. And then it gets out of the way really fast with this quick release snare. Now, since I took a little bit more of the transient on the channel compression, I'm allowing a little bit more to stay in. I'm using a 3 millisecond attack, which is a little bit slower. Still a ratio of 2 and a much faster release. So this is really just for the to level out the decay section, like the section of the waveform immediately after the transient, but before the sustain kicks in, just to kind of like level off, like it gets to the sustain faster, which in this particular style of music I tend to like. And then the toms, again, are all pretty much done the same way for all three. A little bit of a faster attack to keep that stick from jumping out too much. Again, 2-to-1 ratio, so it's still fairly light by compression standards. A little bit of a longer release, though. I tend to start using longer releases on my tom stages because it allows you to kind of like emphasize the natural pitch bend that happens a lot of times when you tune toms in a rock style or any other style where this is desirable. Typically, you'll tune the bottom head higher than the top head, which results in the pitch kind of descending, like boom, like as you strike the drum, and then it rings in descending pitch. This almost using a little bit of a longer release kind of takes a bite out of the center of that, and it like let me see if I can just isolated toms, you can hear it. It's a cool effect that I tend to like. It kind of makes them jump out more, like it catches your ear more without it like being overly noticeable. Let me do this. Seems to be an issue. I talked about making sure your rack mic is aimed away from the snare. When you don't do that, your waveform looks like this, and it's really confusing. So let me make that mistake for you. And then if I remove this compression stage, hear how that tone is like straight. The sustain is unchanged throughout it. If I add this, the sustain gets to where it is, drops suddenly, and then releases at the end of it. It's subtle, but it's a cool effect to me. To me, it like makes the toms jump out a little bit more because it catches your ear. I'm also using a little bit of compression. Again, some VCA compression on my overheads and room mics. In this case, your time constraints are set, but I'm using just 1.8 to 1 ratio, really light. And this is a pretty slow, like by nature of this compressor, it's pretty slow. It's really just to add some color to the room mics. Get out of my tom section here. So this allows me to pull them forward a little bit more. I'm also using an additional compression stage on the kick. Remember when we talked about routing last week, where I tend to send my kicks and my bass to a bus. So I am compressing one more time on this bus here with an optical compressor. So really slow attack, pretty slow release. This is more just for color's sake and to thicken it up a little bit. I'm also, right after that, high passing again because, as we talked about in our compression episode, compression tends to have the effect of adding low end. It's really just flattening the low end and making it more level with the rest of the frequency spectrum. So that is necessary if I want to still boost the low end in the way that I like to. So the kick is going to here with the bass, but then the rest, like snare, toms, and room mics, are coming to this bus, where I am adding some bus compression across all of it just to kind of glue it together, using an FET compressor here. Really just acting on the snare, making the snare more part of the kit. Also see how it like brings it forward. And then I'm also doing just a little bit of EQ across all the drummer in this group really seems to have a thing for bright drums, which is cool. I think in this style it works. So I'm adding some of this top end information, this 8 and 16K, adding a little bit of that back on this bus. Coming over to the bass, again, here's just so you can hear the difference. So there's the DI. That's the dry signal coming straight out of the bass. And then the cabinet mic. So you can hear how there's like, obviously there's drum lead in it, but there's also more low-mid information. But because of this sound is so clean, I'm going to be able to take my sub from that without worrying about it getting overly muddy. Again, same way with the kick. I'm going to treat these as just two parts of the same instrument and process them together. So I tend to high pass my bass a little bit more than the kick. The kick I was up to 27. This I'm taking up to 33. Low passing down to 8.4 just to keep the whatever little information is there in the bass, keep that out of the way. A little bit of compression. 1.8 to 1. Kind of a slower attack and release. Just a little bit to keep each of his notes kind of in relative level to each other the same, like not letting one be noticeably louder or quieter than the other. Again, boosting the low shelf here between 63 and 33. Cutting here in the mid 200s because that is where a lot of the kick fundamental is. And so this lets the kick stay distinct from the bass without getting masked by the bass. You kind of want the kick to just be like equivalent to the front end of each bass note. Like the attack of each bass note is the kick, and the sustain of each kick is the bass, which is why I tend to bust them together, because I treat them like one thing. In this case, I'm actually taking some mid information out as well to let the kick kind of take over. But then I'm also just for the sake of keeping that tone bright and sparkly and able to stand out in the mix, I'm boosting on my shelf up from 6K, but only up to 8K. So without it, kind of nondescript. And then if I add in my kick as well, see how it's covered up. Now all of a sudden there it is. Also using a quick VCA compression stage, really fast attack, slower release. Again, just to normalize that, I kind of just want, I don't need a lot of dynamic information in my bass. I just need the pitch content to be stable so that all the harmony can build on top of it. And then again, this is going through this this LA3A optical compressor along with the kick, just to kind of keep, like if you watch, acting on the kick first, which just puts the kick in the bass kind of on the same playing field, dynamically speaking. So yeah, there's your processing across all of these. Take these away. It's dry. And then they sit in the same space very nicely. Speaking of space, we're also using some time-based effects over here. I'm using one reverb, pretty short, 2.1 second decay, plate reverb. I'm cutting off anything above 15K and then high shelf rolling off after 3K, and I'm also tailoring the low end a bit here on this EQ after the fact. This is predominantly for the snare, or sorry, I take that back. This first reverb is for the drum kit as a whole minus the kick. The kick and the bass you don't really want time-based effects on because you want those to stay stable, and you're kind of cutting the frequencies that they live in out of the reverbs anyway. This send to that reverb is on the bus, so you're catching everything in equal measure. The snare, the hat, the cymbals, and the toms are all going to this reverb. Take that away. Just dries it out. Kind of makes it sound sterile and not real. And then in the longer reverb here, a little bit longer, 2.7 seconds. A little bit more mid information that I've left in it. I've tailored the low end the same way. I'm only using that for the snare, the hat, and the toms, and a little bit on the cymbal mics too, but mostly just for like that big like sense of space every time that snare crack happens. Here, if I got rid of that. So you have this like room simulation reverb, which is really fast and like, coats the sound. And then this, that's where it gets dramatic. You get your sense of power and interacting with the space, and a drummer playing really loudly, like so loudly that he's racketing off the walls. Also, kind of a thing I recently got into on this Omni center room mic, sending this through a quick, like really quick delay. So in this case, it's 122 milliseconds of delay, rolling off anything below 300 hertz and anything above 2100 hertz. No feedback, so like no distinct repeats other than the first one. Also worth pointing out, in the tempo of this song, 122 milliseconds is equivalent to a 30-second note, so it's almost imperceptible, but it, here, I'll A-B it. Now, by itself, it sounds like I might have made it worse, but if I bring it in with everything else, and this is the only thing going through it in the kit, notice how it just livens everything up. It's a subtle effect, but it just makes everything sound that much bigger. Again, kick and bass, no time-based effects, but I am running them through this little sub-harmonic generator. If you don't have monitors or headphones, well, if you don't have headphones, you're probably not going to do this, but it's just adding a little bit of weight in a soft boost around 69 hertz, which is 69 hertz is the fundamental of the key of this song, of D flat. I kind of like boosting that first fundamental of whatever the key of the song is in the kick and the bass. It just kind of locks everything together, and it gives your kick and your bass like a little bit more weight behind them. So there's our processing and our effects. The only other thing to consider is the arrangement in the stereo field. This is probably the first time we'll get into this, but it's going to come back every time we are talking about stereo field placement in the mix. Things are either mono elements or panned elements. Those are kind of two states of being for any sort of audio input. Those are subject to taste just like anything, but in general there are some certain standards, like kick drums and snare drums and basses are always mono elements. They are always panned to the center. You don't need, in the case of the snare, you kind of want that to be the center of the kit. It's the center of time. But in the case of the kick and the bass, it sounds strange if there's that kind of low end in the panned information. Speakers have a hard time dealing with it. Your brain kind of feels like it's strange just because that's become the convention. So that's generally adhered to. So I've got my kick, my snare, and my bass panned dead center, not messed with. And this sub generator I've got on my kick and my bass also is center. My hi-hat, I like to kick over to the right just a little bit, in this case 24%, more on the right than on the left, because if you're looking at a drummer playing the drum set, that's where it would be from your perspective, from the listener's perspective. I pan the toms according to that as well, with the rack kind of middle left, and then in his case where he has 3, I've got one closer to the center, and then one on the farther right. Now, if I had taken my overheads, a near room perspective and a far room perspective, I would have had a little bit more options on this, but in this case, this drummer wanted it this way specifically. But I've got these overheads panned 50% left and right. In the case of only having 2 room mics, I would usually do hard left and hard right. But the sound that we were going for on this kind of called for panning in this configuration. But ordinarily, if I had done what I usually do and taken 2 pairs of room mics in addition to the overheads, I would have been able to have the overheads like this, pan the room mics hard left and hard right, and then pan the far room mics reverse from the overheads, because remember we had them at the same height as the overheads but cross, like their aiming was crossed side to side. So if we had our overheads like this and our rooms like this, kind of creates a 360 effect in the stereo field, like almost like you're in the center of the kit. So if they're both panned hard left and right, it sounds like this. But then if we cross, hear how that's a little bit more of a, it feels like like the cymbals are happening around your head rather than like on the sides of your head or in front of you. But I did not have the foresight to put up that extra room pair on this particular session, but that's okay. It's working out just fine at the moment. That Omni mic I'm keeping center because it's kind of to fill in the holes that are left by putting your overheads and your room mics on the sides. It's nice. It colors your stereo image really nicely to have that drum kit and cymbal information up the sides, but it also kind of leaves a hole, like it starts to sound unnatural. So this Omni mono mic kind of clears that up to blend that in. So if I play it back without it, bring it in. See, it's like at that point, it feels okay, like no longer is this like, I don't know, it makes it seem less sterile and like more real to me. That's just me. I've also got my effects returns all hard left and right. Although in that case, I also have my sends panned opposite of the channel, so that this also kind of creates like a surround effect in stereo where all the information that's coming up the left channel of my drum bus is going to the right side of that reverb and vice versa. So it's like anything you're hearing on the left dry, you're hearing the wet version of it on your right. Just creates a little bit more space in the mix. Um, but yeah, so in terms of miking, processing, and panning, drums and bass, that is what I have for you. Yeah, next week, week 8, our halfway point, which is crazy to think about. We'll be doing a similar topic discussion, although that time it will be about guitars, both electric and acoustic, and keys of all variety, pianos, electric pianos like Rhodes and Wurlitzer, synthesizers, what have you. So we'll be talking about guitars and keys next week, same time, and I hope to see you then.